The morning air in London was calm and cool, the kind that carries a light mist across the streets and makes everything look like it belongs in an old storybook. Tourists lined up along the black iron gates outside the famous palace, holding up their phones and flags. Some were curious, some excited, and some just wanted a glimpse of something they would talk about for years. It was the day an American family, known all over the world, was visiting the royal grounds. And among them was a young man who had grown up in the spotlight, Barron Trump. Barron wasn't just any teenager. For years, his name had been written in newspapers and spoken on television screens around the world. He didn't ask for fame. It was simply a part of his life. People saw him as the son of a powerful family, but not many truly knew who he was as a person. While adults around him debated politics and power, Barron grew up quietly, learning to smile at cameras even when he didn't want to. On this chilly London morning, he was stepping into another moment where all eyes would be on him. The motorcade moved slowly through the grand avenue leading to the palace. The sound of police motorcycles clearing the way mixed with the hum of the crowd waiting at the gates. The palace guards in their tall black hats stood perfectly still, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone walls. Londoners were used to official visits, but this one felt different. The Trump family always brought with them a kind of energy that made headlines before anything even happened. Barron sat by the window of the black car, watching the grand palace grow larger with every passing second. He noticed the flags waving, the flash of cameras, and the way people pointed and whispered. It wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, but there was something about London that felt heavier, like history itself was watching. He took a quiet breath, straightened his jacket, and tried to prepare himself. He had learned over the years that every movement he made could end up on a screen somewhere. When the car finally stopped, the door was opened by a member of the security team. Barron stepped out into the cool air, feeling the slight drizzle on his hands. He walked alongside his family as they were greeted by officials and guards. Everyone was standing tall, moving in a perfectly rehearsed order as if the entire morning had been planned down to the last second. Cameras clicked in bursts like 1,000 tiny fireworks. Barron lifted his head and looked at the grand entrance of the palace. It was bigger and more beautiful than he had imagined. Golden details sparkled faintly under the gray sky. The steps seemed to stretch higher than they really were, giving everything an air of royalty and power. For a moment, despite the noise, despite the cameras, he felt something different. He felt small, but in a good way. It reminded him that the world was full of places and stories much larger than his own. As the group moved toward the palace courtyard, a traditional royal ceremony was about to begin. The royal guards, known for their discipline and silence, were lined up in perfect formation. Their boots were polished so well they almost reflected the cloudy sky. Their steps echoed sharply on the stone ground. Every movement was measured, every sound precise. The crowd outside the gates grew louder with excitement as they caught sight of Barron and his family walking together. Barron had always been polite at public events, though he didn't enjoy being the center of attention. He preferred quiet corners, drawing, reading, or walking without being noticed. But in moments like this, he understood that silence was also a kind of strength. He walked with calm steps, matching the rhythm of the people around him. A few reporters shouted questions from a distance, but they were quickly silenced by the formal atmosphere. There was something special about this visit. For Barron, it wasn't just another trip to another country. London carried a royal charm, a quiet dignity, and an ancient beauty that was unlike anywhere else. He had read about it in history books, but seeing it with his own eyes made it feel real. The palace wasn't just a building, it was a story carved into stone. And today, in some unexpected way, his story was becoming a small part of it. The royal band began to play soft music in the background. The sound of trumpets and drums floated gently through the air. The tune was old, elegant, and proud. Barron stood quietly, hands in front of him as officials spoke to his parents. He could feel dozens of cameras pointed at him, but he tried not to let it bother him. Over the years, he had developed a quiet skill. He knew how to stay calm in a storm of attention. Nearby, the guards stood with perfect stillness. Their tall hats and straight faces gave them a serious look. Tourists often joked that the guards looked like statues, but Barron knew they were highly trained professionals. They were symbols of respect and duty. He found it impressive, how they could stand so straight, not moving even a finger while hundreds of eyes stared at them. Barron's attention drifted for a moment. He looked at the garden beyond the courtyard, where bright flowers bloomed despite the cold weather. It was peaceful. A soft breeze moved through the air, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the crowd. In moments like this, he wished he could simply walk through the gardens alone, without cameras, without security, without pressure. But he knew that was not his reality. Even though he had grown up in a powerful family, Barron was still just a young man with simple dreams. He wanted to travel, learn about the world, and make something of his own, something not tied to his last name. This visit to London, though official, felt like a small window into something different. He was surrounded by elegance and history, and it made him think about his own place in the world. One of the royal officials approached, guiding the family toward the ceremonial path where the guards would perform their short march. The sound of boots striking the ground filled the courtyard as the guards began their routine. Tourists gasped softly, impressed by the perfection of the movements. The guards' sharp turns and synchronized steps looked almost like a carefully practiced dance. Barron walked behind his parents, keeping a respectful distance as instructed. Every step he took was measured, and every glance he gave was calm. He knew exactly where the cameras were and how every angle would be captured. This wasn't just a visit. It was a performance on the world stage. And even if he didn't speak a word, the world would still talk about him. As they approached the front of the courtyard, Barron noticed the expressions of people in the crowd. Some waved enthusiastically, some stared with curiosity, and a few simply raised their phones high in the air to record every second. He could hear fragments of whispers, pieces of excitement, and the soft hum of London itself. It wasn't the loud, chaotic kind of noise he was used to back home. It was steady, rhythmic, almost elegant. In that moment, Barron realized something quiet inside him. Even though he couldn't control what people said or thought, he could control how he carried himself. And sometimes quiet confidence spoke louder than 1,000 words. The royal band ended its first piece with a graceful final note. The crowd clapped politely, the sound echoing through the wide courtyard. Barron stood still, his posture straight, his face calm. It was not an act, it was him choosing peace over noise. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to be present. The palace itself seemed to breathe with history. Every brick, every window, every balcony told a story of the past. Kings and queens had walked these paths for centuries. Barron found it humbling. For someone whose life had always been connected to power and media, it was a rare moment of feeling part of something bigger, something that didn't revolve around him. A light drizzle began again, but no one moved. Umbrellas were raised silently. Guards continued their duty without a single change in expression, and the ceremony went on as planned. Barron didn't mind the raindrops. In fact, he liked the way they felt on his skin. Cool, real, grounding. It was a small reminder that even in the middle of a world built on titles and attention, nature still had its quiet way of making everything equal. The ceremony ended smoothly. Barron followed his family toward the entrance of the palace, walking past the line of guards. Their eyes remained forward, their bodies perfectly still. The tourists cheered softly as the family waved before going inside. But Barron didn't wave for the cameras. He gave a small nod to the crowd, a quiet gesture of respect that only a few noticed. Inside the palace, everything changed. The noise faded behind thick walls, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps on marble floors. Barron looked back one last time at the courtyard. From that angle, it looked almost like a painting. It didn't matter how many photos or videos people would take. None of them would capture the quiet feeling he had standing there. He didn't know that this calm morning would soon turn into something much bigger, something that would travel across headlines around the world. But for now, it was just a quiet moment. A young man, a palace, a crowd, and a story waiting to begin. The air inside the palace was warm and quiet, a sharp contrast to the cool drizzle outside. The grand hallway stretched out like something from a storybook, with golden frames on the walls and sparkling chandeliers above. The polished marble floor reflected the light like a mirror. Barron Trump walked slowly, taking in everything around him. It was beautiful, almost too perfect to be real. He followed behind his parents and the royal officials who were guiding them through the ceremonial path. Everyone moved in an organized line. The sound of soft footsteps echoed gently. Barron kept his hands folded in front of him, his posture straight. Even though this wasn't his first time in a royal setting, it felt different here. London had a way of making history feel alive. As they walked, Barron noticed small details most people wouldn't. The way the gold trim curved along the walls, the faint scent of fresh flowers arranged neatly in tall vases, the subtle shine of polished silver on the tables. Everything was elegant and carefully placed. It was like walking inside a story that had been told for centuries. The family was led out into the palace courtyard again, where the official greeting line was arranged. The royal guard stood at their posts in flawless formation. Their red jackets stood out brightly against the gray sky. The light drizzle had almost stopped, leaving tiny drops on the stone pavement. The courtyard was silent except for the soft sound of boots moving in rhythm. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. Barron stood a few steps behind his parents near the edge of the red carpet laid out for the ceremony. He glanced at the crowd beyond the gates. More people had gathered since they arrived. Some held tiny flags, some wore raincoats, and some just watched with curious eyes. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the official greeting between the two families. For Barron, however, it was just another day of learning how to remain calm while the world watched. A member of the royal staff stepped forward and signaled to the guards to begin a short ceremonial movement. Barron watched carefully. The guards moved in perfect timing, their boots striking the stone with crisp, clear sounds. Their straight backs and steady expressions made them look like they belonged to a world where everything was precise. Barron admired their discipline. He had seen many ceremonies in many countries, but something about the royal guards fascinated him. Their focus was unshakable. Even though hundreds of eyes were on them, they moved as if nothing else existed. Then something happened. Not big, but enough to shift the mood in the air. As the family and officials began to move forward, one of the royal guards stepped into position a bit too quickly. It wasn't on purpose. It was just a moment of mistiming. But the guard's shoulder brushed against Barron's arm. It wasn't rough, but it was sudden and unexpected. For a brief second, Barron lost balance. His foot slid slightly on the wet stone and his body tilted to the side. A nearby security agent quickly reached out to steady him. The guard, realizing the mistake, stiffened even more. His eyes remained forward, as protocol required. Guards were trained not to react no matter what. The people around noticed. Cameras flashed. A few gasps rose from the crowd. It wasn't a dangerous situation, but when you're a Trump, even the smallest movement becomes a headline. Barron straightened himself almost instantly. He wasn't hurt at all. He took a deep breath and gave a small nod to the security agent to signal that he was fine. But the atmosphere had shifted just slightly, like a calm lake where a small stone had been thrown in. Reporters standing behind the barriers quickly lifted their cameras higher. Their eyes sharpened. Moments like this were the kind that spread fast. One photo, one angle, and 1,000 stories would appear. Barron glanced sideways at the guard, who still stood like a statue. The guard's face was expressionless, but Barron could tell he felt the weight of what had just happened. Not because he had meant to do anything wrong, but because protocol around royal events was strict. Even the smallest error could draw attention. The officials near Barron exchanged quiet looks. One of the palace coordinators whispered something to another in a low, calm voice. Everything remained polite on the surface, but behind that calmness, things were already moving. Important events often work that way. What people see is quiet, but behind the scenes, small ripples begin to grow. Barron tried to refocus his mind. He reminded himself of something he had learned early in life. People remember how you react more than what happens. So, he straightened his jacket, fixed his expression into something calm, and kept walking with his family. On the outside, everything looked perfectly fine, but the cameras didn't miss a thing. Someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough that others heard. "Did you see that?" And just like that, a few heads turned, a few more phones were lifted. It wasn't chaos, it was curiosity growing like a quiet wave. Inside the palace, after the greeting ceremony, a group of officials gathered in a small side hall. The Trump family was escorted toward the reception room, but whispers followed. A few members of the team were already making calls. The palace's security officers were talking softly among themselves, making sure everything was in order. Barron could sense the shift in energy. He didn't know exactly what was being said, but he could feel it. He had grown up around powerful people. He could tell when something small was being treated like something big. Later, when the family sat down for a private lunch with their hosts, Barron found a quiet corner by a tall window. From there, he could see the courtyard where it had all happened. Everything looked calm again. The guards stood where they always stood. The crowd had thinned out, but he knew that outside the palace walls, photos and videos of that brief moment were already spreading fast. He wasn't surprised. He knew how stories worked in the real world. Sometimes it wasn't the big events that captured attention. It was the unexpected, the small, the unplanned. A simple brush on the arm could turn into a headline. Meanwhile, some people in the Trump team were already discussing what had happened in a careful, strategic way. They weren't angry. They were concerned. In their world, every detail mattered. Public image was everything. Barron didn't join the conversation. He just listened quietly from where he sat. He didn't like when small things became bigger than they were. It made him feel like he was living inside a story he didn't write. Back in the courtyard, the guard who had brushed against him was standing perfectly still at his post. But within the royal team, quiet discussions had already begun, not because they thought something terrible had happened, but because protocol demanded that everything be examined closely. When royalty and high-profile guests meet, even a tiny mistake is treated seriously. By the time the lunch ended, the story had already reached people far beyond the palace walls. Some online posts had started to appear. A few journalists outside were talking into cameras, describing the moment in their own words. And as often happens, every retelling made the story sound a little more dramatic. Barron walked down the hallway with his family, heading to their next scheduled event. He could hear the distant sound of people outside cheering and talking. It was strange, he thought, how quickly one quiet moment could become the center of attention. He wasn't upset, but he did feel something familiar, the weight of a world that paid more attention to appearances than feelings. He had experienced it many times before, but each time felt slightly heavier. He looked at the reflection of himself in the shiny marble wall. He looked calm, almost untouched by the situation, and maybe that was a good thing. As the day went on, members of the Trump team began to meet with legal advisors. It was a common step in their world. If anything happened around the family, it was immediately reviewed. Not because something terrible had occurred, but because everything was always recorded, discussed, and analyzed. One of the advisors mentioned the word formal complaint, and though Barron wasn't part of that discussion, he overheard enough to understand. He walked to the palace balcony for a few minutes of quiet air. The courtyard below looked peaceful again. The same guard stood in the same place. Tourists walked past the gates, not even knowing how much that one moment was being talked about inside. Barron leaned slightly on the balcony railing, breathing in the cool air. He wished the world could just let small things stay small, but he also knew that wasn't the world he lived in. In his life, everything, even a soft accidental bump, could become news. He didn't blame anyone. Not the guard, not the officials, not the cameras. This was simply the reality of living in the spotlight. But deep inside, he hoped this moment wouldn't grow into something much bigger than it deserved to be. Down below, a small bird landed near the edge of the courtyard fountain, shaking off the raindrops from its wings. It was a small, quiet scene, one that no camera would capture. Barron watched it for a while. It reminded him that beyond all the noise, the world still had quiet corners that didn't care about headlines. As the sun began to set slowly behind the palace, Barron returned inside to join his family. He didn't know it yet, but what had happened earlier that day would grow into something unexpected. Something that would travel across news channels, newspapers, and online platforms for now, though it was just a quiet, calm moment in London. But the first wave of a story had already begun to spread. The next morning, the soft gray sky of London was filled with the usual quiet energy of the city. Cars moved smoothly on the wet streets, shopkeepers lifted their shutters, and tourists gathered outside the palace gates again. But this time, something was different. The crowd wasn't just curious about a royal visit. They were curious about a story. The moment between Barron Trump and the royal guard, in that small, unplanned brush, had already made its way into newspapers, television screens, and online platforms overnight. What had started as a simple accident now had headlines with bold letters. Some called it the palace moment. Others used words like unexpected and tense. There were photos of the exact second Barron tilted to the side. There were slow-motion clips online. People were talking about it everywhere. Inside the hotel where the family was staying, the atmosphere was quiet but not ordinary. People moved with more purpose than usual. Advisors, assistants, and security officers spoke in low voices as they walked through the halls. They weren't panicked, but they were alert. Whenever the Trump family traveled, the smallest moment could turn into a major story. And that's exactly what was happening now. Barron sat by the large window of the suite, looking out at the London skyline. He wore a simple dark sweater and comfortable shoes. He liked mornings like this, quiet, calm, peaceful. But the quiet outside didn't match what was happening inside. Behind him, two members of the team were looking at a laptop, scrolling through news reports. The sound of typing filled the air. He could hear short pieces of their conversation even though they tried to keep their voices low. "Going viral," one of them said softly. "Already 3 major news outlets." Another replied. "Trending in multiple countries." Barron didn't have to look. He knew what they were talking about. He had lived through this kind of thing before. One tiny moment captured on camera turned into something larger than life. It was like watching a snowball roll down a hill. It started small, but it grew bigger and bigger as it moved forward. His phone buzzed on the table. Messages were coming in from friends, classmates, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years. Some sent him links to articles. Some sent little jokes about how famous he had become overnight. A few asked him if it was true. Barron smiled faintly at some of the messages, but deep inside he felt a quiet heaviness. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the story wasn't going to disappear on its own. Meanwhile, in another part of the hotel, lawyers and senior members of the Trump team had gathered in a small meeting room. The mood was serious but calm. They were used to handling media stories. One of them read aloud a headline from a major newspaper. Another played a short clip from a news channel. Everyone in the room listened carefully. "Do we respond?" one of the team members asked. "It depends," another replied. "If we don't, it could grow even more." "And if we do," someone else added, "we have to choose our words very carefully." Barron wasn't part of that meeting, but the energy from it traveled through the walls like a low hum. He could feel it even without being there. Over the years, he had learned that when his name was mentioned in public stories, people around him reacted before he did. He didn't always have control over what happened next, and that was the hardest part. By noon, the news had reached almost every major media outlet. Some focused on the simple details, how the guard brushed past him accidentally. Others added their own theories, trying to make the moment sound more dramatic than it really was. Photos of Barron standing calmly after the brush were shown again and again. Some people praised him for how composed he looked. Others questioned why it had become news at all. But either way, the story was growing. Barron decided to go for a quiet walk inside the hotel's private garden. It was a space reserved for guests only, surrounded by green hedges and small fountains. The cool air felt good on his face. He needed a moment away from screens and whispers. As he walked slowly down the path, he thought about how easily stories could grow. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, and yet people were talking as if something huge had happened. He remembered the moment clearly. The drizzle, the guard stepping forward, the brush on his arm. It wasn't a big deal to him. But to the outside world, it was now a headline. That thought made him sigh softly. A member of the security team approached quietly and told him there would be another meeting soon. Some legal experts from overseas had been contacted to discuss the situation. It wasn't because anyone wanted trouble. It was because they always planned ahead. Every story was treated seriously. When Barron entered the meeting room a little later, he found several people already seated around a long wooden table. They weren't shouting. They weren't angry. They were simply focused. One of the lawyers explained what had happened in a calm voice, going through the headlines one by one. Another person discussed the options, ignoring the situation, issuing a statement, or taking a formal step. Barron listened quietly, his hands resting on the table. He didn't say much, but his presence in the room mattered. After all, the story was about him. One of the lawyers looked at him gently and said, "We need to know how you feel about this." "That matters." Barron took a small breath before speaking. "I'm fine," he said simply. "It was just an accident." The lawyer nodded. "Yes, but sometimes the way the public sees things is different from what actually happened." Another team member added, "We just need to protect your image. That's why we're being careful." Barron understood. He had grown up in a world where reputation was everything. But he couldn't help but wish that sometimes things could just stay simple. Outside, the story continued to spread. On social media, people from different countries were sharing their opinions. Some defended the guard, saying it was clearly an accident. Some supported Barron, admiring the way he remained calm. Others made jokes, memes, and light comments. That's how stories worked online. They had many versions, many voices, and not all of them were fair. By late afternoon, the topic was everywhere. Some journalists were waiting outside the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of Barron or get a short comment. Cameras flashed whenever anyone walked near the entrance. The energy around the place had changed. What had begun as a ceremonial visit now carried a quiet storm of attention. Barron spent the evening in his room, reading a book he had brought with him. But it was hard to focus. Every few minutes, someone knocked softly to update his family about the situation. He didn't show it on his face, but the constant attention felt heavy. He wasn't used to being part of a story like this, not in this way. Later that night, one of the senior advisors visited him privately. The advisor spoke kindly, not like someone giving an order, but like someone offering a path forward. "Barron," the advisor said, "you didn't do anything wrong, but sometimes things around you grow fast. We can take legal steps if needed. That doesn't mean anything bad. It just means we're setting boundaries." Barron looked at the advisor and nodded slowly. He understood the meaning behind those words. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about control, about making sure the story didn't get out of hand. In another part of the city, media channels were hosting discussions. Some presenters talked about royal protocol. Others debated whether it was fair for the story to become such a big deal. Experts gave their opinions. People shared their views online. And the moment grew even bigger without Barron saying a single word. Back in his room, Barron stood near the window, watching the city lights. London at night was beautiful, glowing softly, quiet in its own way. The noise outside didn't reach his ears, but he knew it was there. The story had a life of its own now. He thought about the guard. He imagined how the guard might be feeling too. After all, the moment had been just as unexpected for him. Barron didn't feel anger. He didn't feel like someone who needed to fight a battle. But he also understood that in his world, sometimes stories didn't give you a choice. They pulled you in whether you wanted it or not. Before going to bed, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. He didn't look different, but his name was now at the center of something much larger. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew the story wasn't over. As he turned off the light, the city outside kept moving. News anchors kept talking. Headlines kept changing. And somewhere in a quiet palace courtyard, a single moment replayed again and again in people's minds. The struggle wasn't a loud one. It wasn't about anger or conflict. It was about silence, attention, and the weight of being seen by the whole world. Barron didn't show it on his face, but deep down, he understood exactly how powerful and complicated a single moment could become. And he also knew that soon, a decision would have to be made. The city of London woke up the next day with the same quiet drizzle and gray clouds, but something in the air felt sharper. Television screens in cafes played the same clip over and over. Newspapers at train stations carried photos of Barron Trump at the palace courtyard. Online, the story was everywhere. People were no longer just curious. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the hotel, the Trump team was already awake early. Advisors, legal representatives, and communication experts sat in small groups, speaking softly but quickly. Some held printed papers with statements drafted overnight. Others scrolled through news updates, trying to keep up with everything being said. It wasn't chaos, but it was close to it. A quiet storm of planning, preparing, and deciding. Barron sat in a different room, away from the busy noise of meetings. He had a cup of warm tea in his hands and was staring at the soft light coming through the window. It was early morning, the kind of quiet time he usually loved. But this morning, the silence felt heavier than usual. He knew what everyone outside that room was talking about. He also knew that his name was at the center of something he never planned. He didn't like being part of headlines. He preferred moments where people weren't looking at him, where he could just be himself. But growing up in the public eye had taught him something important. Sometimes moments choose you, not the other way around. A soft knock came on the door. One of the senior advisors stepped inside. He spoke gently, as if careful not to disturb Barron's quiet. "Good morning," he said. "We need to talk." Barron placed the teacup down and nodded. The advisor explained that several legal teams were suggesting a formal action. It wasn't about anger or blame. It was about showing that his personal space mattered. In their world, that kind of step was seen as a statement. It told the world, "We noticed. We care." Barron listened silently. He didn't interrupt. He understood why they were saying this. He also understood something deeper. Every action would carry a message, even if he didn't speak a single word. Later that morning, the Trump team held a private meeting. The atmosphere was serious but calm. Everyone had their own view on what should happen next. Some believed a legal step would help shape the story carefully. Others thought staying quiet might make the story fade away. But one thing was clear: people were waiting for a reaction. And if they didn't give one, the world would create its own. Barron walked into the meeting halfway through. The room grew quieter when he entered. Though he didn't usually lead discussions, his presence carried weight. Everyone was talking about him, but now he was in the room with them. A lawyer spoke first, laying out the options. One option is to take no action. Let the story pass. But if we do that, others might shape it their own way. Another option is to make a formal statement or take legal steps. That will control the narrative. It will show that boundaries matter. Barron sat quietly, his hands resting on the table. He didn't rush to answer. He could feel everyone watching him, waiting to hear what he thought. He wasn't used to being the decision-maker in rooms like this, but something inside him told him that this moment was different. "Can I speak?" Barron said softly. "Of course," the advisor replied immediately. Barron took a breath. He spoke slowly, carefully, but his voice was steady. "I know everyone wants to handle this in a smart way. I know it's about protecting the family's image, but it wasn't a big thing. It was just a moment. I don't want it to become something bigger than it should be." His words hung in the air for a few seconds. A few people exchanged glances. It wasn't the answer some expected, but it was honest. The advisor leaned forward. "Barron, people are watching. Even silence becomes a statement. If we don't say something, someone else will." Barron nodded. "I understand. But maybe what we say should be simple, real, not loud, just honest." There was something about the way he spoke, calm, clear, and thoughtful, that softened the room. A few people who had been strongly in favor of legal action lowered their voices. It wasn't because he gave orders. It was because he reminded them of something they sometimes forgot. At the center of the story was a real person, not just a headline. After a long discussion, the team agreed that Barron should make a short statement. It would be simple, kind, and clear. They didn't want to create a bigger wave. They just wanted to let the world know how he felt, in his own words. The statement was scheduled for the afternoon. News channels were already talking about it even before it happened. "A response is coming," they said. Cameras were set up near the hotel entrance. Journalists gathered on the sidewalk, holding microphones, waiting for the moment. Barron spent the hours before the statement in quiet thought. He wasn't nervous, but he was thoughtful. He knew how fast words could travel. He wanted to be sure that what he said would be his words, not a script someone handed to him. He looked out the window at the city once more. The rain had stopped, and a soft golden light was peeking through the clouds. When the time came, a small press area was arranged in the lobby of the hotel. There were no bright decorations or dramatic lights. Just a simple podium, a microphone, and rows of reporters standing behind a velvet rope. The cameras clicked as soon as Barron stepped into the room. He was dressed simply, a dark blazer over a white shirt. He walked calmly, his steps quiet but sure. Everyone watched him. It wasn't just another press appearance. People could sense that something honest was about to be said. He reached the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and took a small breath. The room fell completely silent. Even the clicking of cameras paused for a second. He didn't have pages of paper in front of him. He didn't have a teleprompter. He just had his thoughts, and then he spoke. "It was an accident," Barron said softly but clearly. "I wasn't hurt. I respect the people who work to keep places like the palace safe. I don't want this to become bigger than it is. I think we should all move on." 9 seconds. That's all it took. 9 seconds of calm, honest words that carried more weight than 100 long speeches. For a moment, the reporters didn't move. Then the clicking of cameras began again, this time louder, faster, almost like a heartbeat. The advisors watching from the side exchanged quiet looks. They knew instantly that something had shifted. What had been a swirling storm of opinions, theories, and headlines suddenly met a simple, steady voice. The tension that had built over 2 days didn't explode. It softened. Within an hour, clips of Barron's short statement were everywhere. News channels played it repeatedly. Commentators described it as unexpected, mature, and remarkably calm. People online began sharing the clip with their own words of support. Some said it was refreshing to hear something so honest. Others said the 9-second statement spoke louder than anything else could have. Back in his room, Barron sat quietly again. He wasn't celebrating or smiling widely. He wasn't thinking about trending numbers or news clips. He just felt lighter. It was the first time in days that the weight on his chest felt smaller. Meanwhile, in the palace, the royal guard involved in the incident had also heard the statement. Though he didn't react publicly, those close to him said he felt a quiet sense of relief. The palace released a brief message thanking the Trump family for their visit and expressing mutual respect. The story that once seemed ready to grow into something huge began to settle, like waves calming after a storm. Reporters outside began changing their tone. Instead of asking what will happen next, they were now saying, "It seems everything has been resolved." Comment. Sections that had once been full of guesses and heated opinions now carried simple words like respect, class, and grace. But what truly surprised many wasn't the statement itself, and it was who gave it. Barron Trump had often been seen as quiet and reserved. Many didn't expect him to step forward at all, but in that single calm moment, he had taken control of the story without shouting, without blaming, without turning it into a battle. And that's why it spread even faster than the original news. As the evening fell, London lights reflected softly on the wet streets again. The storm of attention hadn't completely disappeared, but its shape had changed. It wasn't a wave of questions anymore. It was a quiet respect. Barron sat on the hotel balcony that night, feeling the soft wind on his face. He had said what he wanted to say, nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time since the brush in the palace courtyard, he felt like he wasn't just part of the story. He had shaped it. Sometimes power doesn't come from loud voices or long speeches. Sometimes it comes from a calm sentence said at the right time. And though Barron didn't plan it, that's exactly what he had done. The soft morning light spread across the city like a quiet promise. London had a calm glow that day. The rain had stopped and the sky had slowly begun to clear, showing soft patches of blue between the gray clouds. It was the kind of day that felt peaceful, the kind where the world took a slow breath after a busy storm. The day after Barron Trump gave his short 9-second statement, the energy around the city was noticeably different. Reporters still stood outside the hotel, but their voices were softer. The crowd was smaller. The tension that had wrapped around the story for the past few days had melted away like morning fog. People weren't waiting for a new headline anymore. They were still talking, but this time the tone was calm. Inside the hotel, the Trump team was gathered in the lobby with quiet smiles. The heavy discussions, urgent whispers, and serious faces had faded. There was a gentle ease in the air now. The senior advisor leaned back in his chair, watching clips of Barron's short statement playing on television. Every news channel seemed to be repeating the same 9 seconds. The soft tone, the clear words, and the calm face. No one had expected the entire storm to quiet down so quickly. Across different parts of the world, people were talking not about what had happened with the guard anymore, but about how Barron had handled it. Commentators described his response as remarkably composed. Some said it showed maturity beyond his age. Others said it reminded them that sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones. People online shared his words with captions like class, respect, and quiet strength. Barron was sitting in his room again by the window, watching the city below. Cars moved smoothly on the wet road. The early sunlight made the rooftops shine faintly. It was a view he had grown to like over the past few days. It made him feel calm. But what made the moment even quieter was the fact that the loud noise of headlines had started to fade. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like someone who had done something extraordinary. He had simply spoken the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. But the world had listened. Downstairs, members of the team discussed how surprisingly fast the story had changed direction. People expected a fight, one advisor said softly. But instead he gave them honesty, and honesty always travels fast. The legal teams, who had spent long hours preparing different options, now sat with quiet relief. They no longer needed to file anything. There would be no complicated process, no endless press conferences. The story had ended not with noise, but with a calm voice. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, the guard who had accidentally brushed past Barron had gone back to his usual routine. The palace had released a brief message thanking the Trump family for their kind understanding and their respectful words. The guard was not publicly named, and the incident wasn't treated like a scandal anymore. It was treated as what it truly was, a small, human moment that had passed. In quiet corners of the internet, people who had argued fiercely about the story were now agreeing on one thing. The young man's response had ended the noise better than anyone else could have. Comment sections were filled with words of support. Some people said they were surprised. Others said they were impressed. A few simply said, "This is how things should be handled." Barron's phone began to fill with new kinds of messages. This time they weren't filled with links to exaggerated headlines. They were messages of respect and kind words from people who had watched his statement. Friends from school, people he hadn't spoken to in years, even some strangers who managed to reach out through public platforms. All of them wrote words like, "Proud of you," "Well done," and "You handled it with grace." He didn't respond to all of them, but he read many of them carefully. He didn't need the praise, but it made him realize something quietly powerful. Sometimes, one moment can shape how people see you for a long time. That afternoon, Barron took a short walk outside the hotel with a small security team. The crowd outside wasn't nearly as big as it had been before. A few people waved and some smiled warmly. One older woman standing by the fence said softly, "Good job," as he walked past. It wasn't loud, but it felt genuine. Barron gave a small nod in return. The streets of London were alive again with their usual rhythm. Cars, chatter, footsteps, and distant bells ringing from towers. It felt like everything was back to normal. But in Barron's world, something had quietly changed. For the first time, he felt like he had been seen not as just a name connected to a family, but as a person with his own voice. Back at the hotel, members of the Trump team spoke quietly about the reaction. One advisor smiled and said, "It's rare to see something calm make more noise than something loud." The others agreed. They had expected days of headlines, endless interviews, and long conversations. But instead, one honest moment had closed the story before it could become something bigger. A few hours later, international newspapers began releasing their final updates. Some headlines read, "Barron Trump's calm words changed the story." Others said, "The 9-second response that ended a global headline." Even commentators who often disagreed found themselves repeating the same idea. It was a small act, but a strong one. In many ways, it surprised people. The world was used to long speeches, complicated press conferences, and endless statements. But this time the story was different. It ended not with noise but with stillness. That was what made it special. Inside the palace, the royal staff quietly appreciated how gracefully everything had been handled. In private conversations, some of them even said it had been one of the smoothest resolutions they had ever seen in a situation like this. The guard continued his daily duty without disruption, and the palace didn't need to do more than release a polite message of thanks. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Barron stood on the balcony again. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink. The city lights slowly began to glow. He rested his hands on the railing and felt the quiet breeze against his face. For the first time in several days, there was no pressure pressing down on his shoulders. No camera flashes, no anxious whispers. Just calm. He thought about everything that had happened. A simple brush, a storm of attention, long meetings, and finally, 9 seconds of words that changed everything. It still amazed him how something so small could travel so far. But more than anything, he realized something important about himself. He had spent much of his life standing quietly while the world talked about him. But in this moment, for the first time, he had spoken for himself, and the world had listened. Later that night, when the team gathered for dinner in the hotel's dining room, the mood was light and easy. No one talked about legal action anymore. No one talked about crisis strategies or media control. They talked about normal things, travel, plans, the beauty of London. It felt like a weight had lifted off everyone's shoulders. One of the senior advisors raised a small toast, saying, "To the calmest voice in the room." Everyone smiled. Barron smiled too, a small, real smile. Not for the cameras. Just for himself. Outside the hotel, the media presence had mostly cleared out. The story was still being mentioned here and there, but it was no longer at the center of attention. People had moved on, and in that quiet moving on, something important had remained: respect. In the days that followed, a few newspapers published thoughtful pieces about how a single calm statement had done more than any complicated plan could have. They called it a lesson in quiet leadership. Commentators spoke about it as an example of how young people could influence the world without shouting. Barron didn't see himself that way. He didn't see himself as someone who had taught a lesson, but deep inside he felt a quiet kind of strength. Not the loud kind that demands attention, the quiet kind that lives in stillness. As the family prepared to leave London, the city seemed different to him. The palace visit, which had begun as just another formal event, had turned into a chapter in his life he would never forget. Not because of the incident itself, but because of what came after. The calm, the clarity, and the choice to speak his own truth. On the drive to the airport, Barron looked out of the car window. The palace gates passed by in the distance. Tourists were still taking pictures, and guards stood at their posts as always. It all looked exactly the same as it had a few days earlier, but to Barron it felt changed. Because he had changed. He had learned that sometimes real strength doesn't come from control or power. It comes from choosing to be calm when the world expects noise. It comes from speaking when you have something true to say, even if it takes only 9 seconds. And so, as the plane lifted off into the soft evening sky, leaving London behind, Barron Trump carried with him something more valuable than a headline. He carried a quiet moment that had shown him who he truly was.